during this program has been really to try and give you that balance, right? To simply give you the opportunity to learn more about conservative ideas. So at this conference, instead of having to hear from people like Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, you actually really hear from awesome speakers like Dinesh D'Souza, Rachel Campos Duffy, Robert Spencer, and Jake Jacobs, and Larry Schweiker, and many others. Instead of being forced to learn, obscure subjects like the feminist perspective on Marxist thought, or the paradigm of lesbian Eskimos living in Brazil, you're actually able to learn about the virtues of the free market. And instead of being surrounded by your classmates at your high schools that hate conservative ideas and hate conservative leaders and want to attack what you guys believe in, at least for a few days you've been surrounded by a number of your peers who actually love conservatism and love conservative leaders. However, we really won't consider this conference a success until we see increased activism on your campus. And we really hope that this program is like a springboard for further activism on your part. And I know a lot of the other speakers at this event have focused on sort of conservative ideas and conservative policy. What I'm going to do during my session is focus on how you can take those ideas back and how you can present them on your high school campuses or when you get to your college campuses in the fall. And really share with you some specific ideas, activism programs, strategies, and other things that you can do to be a successful activist in your area. Now, what is a successful activist? I think we should first talk briefly about that. Because there's a lot of different views as to how do you determine, how do you figure out who is a successful activist. Some will say, well, a successful activist is first determined by the number of activities that activist is involved in. So are they involved in a club? What does that club do? Do they bring speakers in? How often? How many times are they out promoting their ideas on campus? So it's just strictly on the volume of activity. Well, others will say, no, you can't just have the activities. You also need to learn the ideas behind the activism. And I agree with that. That's why we have programs like this one, where we give you all an opportunity to learn more about the conservative movement. However, I think there's truly a third component that really emphasizes and defines what a successful activist is. And that is their activist mentality, right? So in other words, what are the strategies? What are the approaches that those activists take to communicate their ideas on campus? So for example, you can have a recruitment table at your high school set up after school almost every single day. However, if the activities you're pushing through your recruitment table, if the ideas that you're focusing on, if they don't resonate with other students on your campus, obviously you're not going to be as successful as you would like. So you really have to develop that activist mentality, and that's what I'm going to focus on as part of my speech. But before I get into that, I think I would be remiss if I first at least touch on or talk about the reactions that you all will definitely receive if you choose to be active on sort of like a traditional high school or college campus. And you may have seen or heard about the intolerance that occurs towards conservatives on high school and college campuses in the past. Like, for example, in the past, they have been seen burning Bibles outside of lecture halls, featuring conservative speakers. We've also seen them hurl racial epithets at black conservatives when they have spoken on college campuses. We recently had basically a riot at CSULA when we had Ben Shapiro speak there. The leftists on campus felt that he had no right to even speak, so let's just shut down the event. Instead of liberals actually challenging our speakers with thought-provoking questions, we also see them resorting at times to throwing food at our speakers, throwing bricks through windows, just trying to stop these events from occurring. In high schools, you may have heard the stories in the past where a high school student a high school teacher threatened a student with arrest for merely being critical of Barack Obama. There also was the story where a middle school teacher asked his class to do opposition research for the Obama campaign. And there's also the example that happened right up the road at UC Santa Barbara, where we had a high school student and she was on campus in the free speech zone talking about her pro-life values, and a professor was on campus, didn't like this, went up to this pro-life student, basically assaulted her, stole her sign, and ran away with him. And you would think that, the university would be like, we don't really condone assaulting students on our campus, but in reality, the university backed up the professor and chastised the students for being there talking about pro-life ideas, which is just insane. And that's what's really frustrating. You rarely hear prominent liberals in the media or elsewhere actually come out and say, hey, we may not agree with what the conservative students are saying on these college campuses, but we should at least allow them to present their ideas. But that rarely happens. You rarely see Bill Maher talk about that. But to further hammer home how liberals try, at least liberal administrators on high school and college campuses really try to work against conservative students and do their best to ensure only one viewpoint is heard. One example I always like to share is something that we call the liberal speaker parade. And this may not happen as much at your high schools, but it certainly happens a lot on college campuses. And basically what you'll discover are instances where, say, for example, at Boise State University, this is a school where over a 6-year period, it was discovered that the school spent $600,000 on liberal speakers, and over that same period, $0 on conservatives. At Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, this school over a 4-year period spent $140,000 on liberal speakers and only $15,000 on conservatives. Syracuse University, the ratio from 2003 of liberal speakers to conservatives was 13 to 1. So for every conservative speaker that appeared on campus, there were 13 liberals. And at Emory University, over a 4-year period, there were 35 liberal speakers and only 5 conservatives. And what's interesting about the examples at Lehigh and Syracuse and Emory is that, yes, there were some conservative speakers that had appeared on campus during that time, but those conservative speakers weren't brought in through like the Conservative Student Club on campus. They were brought in through you guys. They weren't brought in through like the Distinguished Lecture Series and the deans and so on. It was up to the students to do that work that the school should be doing, right? Which shouldn't be the case. But what is worse than basically the sort of liberal speaker parade are the instances where the administrations on college campuses actually go out of their way to try to impede our ideas and try to impede us and try and impede you all from reaching the broadest possible audience. Now, there's a number of examples I can cite, and there's stuff that we deal with almost every day at Young America's Foundation. Stuff is always going on that's coming up. But one example I do want to share occurred with one of the speakers that you heard from this week, and that is Dinesh D'Souza. He's a fantastic speaker, and we were working with another student, this guy by the name of Ben, who went to Gonzaga University, and he attended one of our other programs earlier last fall. And he left the program fired up. He wanted to do more on his campus. And he wanted to bring in Dinesh D'Souza, so we said, yeah, we'll help you make this happen. So we worked with him, he got some funding from his school, we scheduled a date, and the event was set, we were ready to go. Now, of course, Ben, who was organizing the event, he wanted to reach the broadest possible audience. That's your goal for all of your programs, right? And so he didn't just want the students on campus to hear Dinesh's lecture, he also wanted to invite the local community to come in and to hear this program. Now, since Gonzaga is a private Catholic school, he had to get the school's permission to open up the event to allow the community to come in to hear Dinesh's lecture. And frankly, he thought this wouldn't be a big deal. This stuff happens all the time. People come in on campus. It shouldn't be an issue. Well, frankly, unfortunately, he faced a lot of objections at the school. And the school definitely had a different plan as far as what Ben wanted to accomplish. Ben went to a bunch of meetings, tried to get permission, and he was eventually told by the school that his event would not be open to the community near Gonzaga University, that the event would only be open to students on campus and the faculty. And this was a firm decision made by the Dean of Students, Campus Security, and the Public Relations Office. Ben was told it wasn't going to be open to the public because D'Souza's beliefs are contradictory to Gonzaga's social justice mission, which is kind of interesting considering that Dinesh is also a product of Catholic Jesuit education, and that Gonzaga didn't want the public to question why they would have a speaker like Dinesh on their campus. He also said he was homophobic and that he was anti-immigration, which is also kind of odd since Dinesh is also an immigrant himself. And they deemed basically Dinesh just to be a nasty guy. So we encouraged Ben to do some research, and he went through some of the recent events. And what we found out, not surprisingly, was that the school never had any issues with liberal programs being open to the public and having the community come in on campus to hear these events. So for example, they had a Dream Week, which was talking about why illegal immigration should be allowed. No problem, bring the whole community in. They had an International Day of Tolerance. No issue with that, bring the entire community in if you want. There was a lecture on Islam and just war, no issues with that. And they also held a pro-Palestinian play. Again, no issues with community coming in to see that program. So shockingly, or maybe not surprisingly, they discovered that it was only the conservative speakers that were closed off from the community coming in to hearing these events on this campus. One other thing I want to stress, and it didn't come up in this case, but I do want to raise it here before I forget, is that if you're trying to promote your ideas at your high schools or even when you get to your college campus, one objection that you all might face, and you need to be aware of it in case it's raised, is sometimes the administrators will tell you you can't promote conservatism because you are being political in some ways. And if you're faced with the objection, I encourage you to kind of push back against this. Dane and I were talking about this earlier today. He came up with, he had this issue raised at his school. But basically what they're doing is they're saying, just by talking about conservatism, you're somehow violating the school's tax status. They're trying to use IRS tax law to try and intimidate you and stop you from promoting your ideas. But frankly, if you're just out on your high school campus or when you get to college and you just want to talk about conservative ideas, like why you love individual freedom and free enterprise and limited government, that's not being political in the IRS definition. You are being educational. You are educating students at your school about conservative ideas, right? Just like there may be like a social justice club at your school or an environmental club that talks about why we need to stop global warming or climate change or whatever they want to call it now. Just as they have a right to talk about their ideas, you have those same rights. So just don't let the administrators intimidate you from speaking out by saying you're being political. I can get into this a lot more, but I'll just leave it at that. And if you face this objection, please come to us and we'll help you work through that. But in any case, back to Ben and Gonzaga and the Dinesh lecture at Gonzaga. Basically, Ben wasn't going to allow his event to be censored in any way. So he worked with us at Young America's Foundation. We got the story out, and we basically got his event covered on a lot of national publications. Fox News picked up on it. There was a lot of other stories in the community that were aired locally, and that certainly got the entire community outraged. And the lesson from this really is once you expose how the university is trying to undermine your event or to censor you or to stomp on your free speech rights, once you expose those efforts, 9 times out of 10, the university always backs down, and they did in this case. And so they opened the event up to the entire public, and on the night of the event, despite a small faculty protest where they did a poetry reading, about 30 people, which is what happened, which was bizarre. Dinesh ended up speaking to about 800 students and community members, and he signed books for hundreds of people. So it was really, in the end, a great success for him. Now, what I think we can learn from examples like this, though, and many, many others, is I think it underscores how determined the left is to maintain their monopoly and to keep their core concepts basically from being challenged. I mean, they're not really for diversity in education, they're for intimidation and indoctrination, in my view. And despite having control of the White House, mainstream media, Hollywood, a lot of colleges and high schools, what's strange is there's a lot of liberal administrators out there at your high schools, I mean, certainly when you get to a traditional college campus, who are somehow threatened by the fact that there are students like you who simply just want to talk about conservative ideas. Like at some schools, it's so bad that just the mere sort of presence of conservative students is somehow like a threat to their liberal sensibilities. It's like your existence is a microaggression in and of itself. It's just bizarre. And I always felt the response to like conservative activism on college campuses and at high schools was kind of strange. Like, I think the liberal response to what you guys try to do should always be something like, hey, go ahead, start your one conservative club, bring in your one conservative speaker. We know that our ideas can withstand anything that you have to offer. We have liberal programs and liberal initiatives going on every single day on this campus. So go ahead, do whatever you want to do. It's not going to impact us. But obviously that's not what they do. They try and intimidate you, shut you down, use dirty tricks and bureaucratic maneuvers and try and stop your events from happening. And these approaches, what they do on college campuses, is not limited just to the campuses. The same tactics that are first learned on high school and college campuses is then used on the national level. So for example, right after we had this event at CSULA, where there was basically, as I mentioned, a near riot because students on campus had just felt Ben Shapiro should not be allowed to speak on campus, the same ideas that the protesters were expressing were then used, and you can see them using at a lot of Trump rallies that occur all around this country. You see people just saying Trump, whether you like him or hate him, just simply does not have the right to speak, and they want to try and shut them down. So the same tactics you see on college campuses is then used on the national level. But in addition, even though over the course of history, even recent history, where at least politically and during certain initiatives and national initiatives and votes and whatnot, even though there's been times where the left and their ideas have been seemingly been defeated, what's interesting is they never stop pressing their ideas. They never hold back. So for example, let's look at a little bit of recent history. After the 2000 and 2004 presidential elections, right? The left could have just given up. They could have said, we can't defeat President Bush, we're going to pack it in and just go do whatever. But they didn't. They relentlessly attacked our ideas, they relentlessly attacked our leaders, and they were able to convince the American people that conservative ideas somehow were hurting our country, and we got President Barack Obama because of it. Now after the 2010 midterm elections, the conservatives were victorious, took back the House, and a lot of conservatives after that election were like, man, there is no way Barack Obama is going to win in 2012. We had this huge victory, we're going to be okay. Well, obviously that didn't happen. He kept pressing forward with his ideas. Same thing with the most recent 2014 congressional elections. Even a bigger victory for conservatives. And people were very optimistic afterwards. But, I think we're not as optimistic anymore. So I think it underscores that one, after all these shellackings, as Barack Obama called them, during these congressional elections, did he moderate his ideas? Did he ever consider hanging out or talking with or considering conservative legislation? No. He kept pressing forward with his agenda. And regardless of what happens in November, even if whatever candidate you feel is going to take over, win, and become like the conservative leader of the future, what we can't fall into the trap of is thinking that one election, again, regardless of what happens, will turn the tide away from more government control. And what's also you also want to keep in mind is that, after a lot of elections, even when conservatives are victorious, we make the mistake of going home. I'm not sure who said this, I think it was Andrew Breitbart or another conservative activist, but he said basically after elections, conservatives go home and relax, put their feet up, the left keeps fighting. Well, we have to keep that same mentality and never become complacent and never just assume our ideas are going to win out in the end. And honestly, if you all want to become like a leader, later on in your life, if you want to run for Congress, honestly, there's no better time to do that than right now. And basically setting up and learning and becoming a leader on your high school campus and on your college campus. And developing that activist mentality and learning how to respond to the left and how to deal with that. Because I guarantee you, once you start speaking out, obviously the left will be there and ready to come after you. I mean, we see it all the time. But what we don't see as much, we need to see a lot more of, is we need to see you guys doing this in a way, right? We need to see you guys going into the belly of the beast and challenging liberal ideas. You don't want to be disruptive as they are. You shouldn't be throwing pies at people. You shouldn't be trying to start riots basically on your campus. But you should be there to challenge what's going on at your schools. And I know that can seem intimidating. It is. But what you should remember, though, is that, well, yeah, you may not represent the majority of opinion on campus, but you do represent the majority of opinion in society at large. And you sort of need to see your role as reminding the campus community that there is like a real world outside the campus boundaries that feels that their academic value system is like ludicrous. You almost have to see yourselves as like the same ones in the asylum. And also don't forget too that there's a lot of students at your schools who are not interested in this stuff. They're kind of moderate on the side, don't pay attention a lot to what's going on in the news. But, if over the next 4 years, like say the incoming freshman class at your high schools goes for the next 4 years and never hears any conservative ideas, they can become liberal by osmosis. So it's important that you all are there speaking out and presenting our ideas at your school. Now, how do you do this? Well, I know some of you are already active, but if you haven't stepped up yet and you want to do so, you can have a tremendous impact at your high schools or even when you get to your college campus. I don't care even if it's a very liberal school. You can really work hard and change it for the better. But the key to your success, honestly, is to boldly challenge the other side and boldly promote your ideas. The last thing you want to do is not to kind of try and get along with the other side or, God forbid, try to appease them. Your goal is to boldly promote your ideas at your high schools. Now, unfortunately, during my time with Young America's Foundation, I've noticed that our students, our activists, tend to follow one of two approaches when trying to promote our campus activities. And over the course of my time at the foundation, I've noticed that sometimes our students follow what I call passive activism. Now, what's that? Well, yes, these are conservative students. They're in a conservative club. They may have activities, but their activities focus a lot on doing things like maybe having social events, maybe playing touch football with the Young Democrats, voter registration drives and things like that. And, there's nothing inherently wrong with these activities, and they can be a component of what any group does on any given high school campus. But in and of themselves, these activities do very little to actually promote our ideas to other students at these schools. It's almost like these groups have adopted a live and let live philosophy. In other words, as long as the liberal groups never directly come after their club, they'll leave the left alone. But in turn, in doing so, the liberal groups get whatever they want. They get all the programs they want, all the funding they want, and so on. On the other hand, there are other students, like some of you in this room, who follow what I call bold activism, and that you make a point to promote your ideas each week at your high schools, whether that's through blogging, tweeting, putting out flyers, whatever it may be. And it's the students that follow this bolder approach to activism that have a much broader impact and longer impact at their schools than those that follow the passive approach. And I always like to compare these two approaches to campus activism back to how two past Republican presidents dealt with the former Soviet Union. And Robert Spencer touched on this a little bit. On the one hand, there was a president like Richard Nixon. If you don't remember your history, Richard Nixon's philosophy towards dealing with the Soviets was détente. He wanted to maintain the status quo, and so on. Even though the Soviets were determined to destroy our way of life, he kind of wanted to go along with them. And because of this policy that Nixon followed, along with Presidents Ford and Carter, that we slowly saw communism gaining ground and freedom losing ground. On the other hand, as we all know, there's a president like Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's point and goal was to confront and defeat the Soviets. He called them an evil empire. He challenged Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. It was because of Ronald Reagan's bold approach in dealing with the Soviets that he is often credited, and rightly credited, with ending the Cold War. Well, in my view, you want to take Ronald Reagan's style of handling the Soviets to applying that same style to handling the other side, the liberals, on your college campus and following what I call a Ronald Reagan model of campus activism. Now, how do you follow this model? Well, first of all, you need to have a club at your high schools. And let me emphasize that Young America's Foundation, we will work with any student, any organization, any club that wants to get involved in our programs. But if you discover that you don't have a conservative club at your high school, we would encourage you to start a Young Americans for Freedom chapter. We've been spending the last couple days learning about Ronald Reagan. You know, Ronald Reagan was very closely associated with Young Americans for Freedom. He got involved with YAF in 1962 as part of our advisory board and was involved with YAF throughout his lifetime. But by starting a YAF chapter, we'll work with you hand in hand and get your chapter up and running quickly, give you the resources that you need to help you get up and running and make an impact. Now, but regardless, you need to have a club, because a club will give you a vehicle to promote your ideas to other students, to attract them to your organization, bring them in. And if you want to bring a speaker to your campus, right, or to your high school, your school, if they have funding available, is not going to give you personally, say, like $1,000 to bring a speaker to your campus. You're going to need to have some organizational vehicle or club to do this. So you have to have some type of club in place if you want to promote these ideas in your community. Now, in terms of just once you have your club, one of the basic things you need to worry about or think about, and it happens with groups that are either been around for a month or 1 year, is the main issue that a lot of groups face is how do they attract members to your organization, and how do they just maintain their presence, and how do they just maintain interest in their club. Well, following the Reagan model will help you solve this problem, because attracting members to your organization really boils down to, in my mind, how often do other students at your schools actually see you guys out there physically at your high schools actually like doing things? Like not just on Facebook and not just on Twitter, but actually on your high school campus out there with a program. And yes, you want to maintain your social media presence. That's great. You want to have that too. But the students at your schools also need to see you like physically active on campus and having programs there. Because your visibility is what shows that you actually do things. Like, why should students actually come to your club meetings if they think that you don't do anything? Like, why should they even waste their time, right? So you have to make them seem like their time coming to your club meetings is well worth it. And so just to give you an example of why this is important, a couple years ago, Young America's Foundation, we conducted a nationwide poll. And we wanted to figure out, like, how do we activate more conservative students at high schools, right? And we knew how to reach and activate, like, the key conservative club leaders. But we knew there were as many more conservative students out there on high schools and college campuses, again, who were conservative, but they weren't involved in clubs. And so we did this nationwide poll. It was a top scientific poll. And what we found out, we really wanted to drill down and figure out, how do we get those students to get active and join a conservative club? And what we found out was really interesting. And that is, despite this being the era of like Snapchat and Tumblr and Vine and Facebook and whatever other social media network that's out there, is that it's the timeless outreach methods, frankly, that are still important to encouraging students to join your organizations, whatever they may be. Their primary hesitation to joining a conservative club basically was, I don't know anyone else involved. 70% didn't care if the club was respected by the faculty. That wasn't an issue. But also, 64% weren't likely to join a club that focuses on issues, conservative ideas, that matter to them. The big issue was they felt that they weren't going to be liked or didn't know anyone in this organization. So for example, one of the high school students, high school YAF chapter leaders that we've had at our conferences, she's a leader in a high school chapter in Ohio. She told me that she was considering joining the YAF club at her high school for months. She kept thinking about it and thinking about it, but it wasn't until that she saw the current YAF leaders at her high school actually with a recruitment table set up during their lunch hour, where she was able to go and like talk to them, get to know them, interact with them, where she then felt comfortable then going to the meeting. And because of that first interaction, she then, yes, got involved, and now she's like the vice chair of the club. So again, you can't overlook sort of the face-to-face, timeless interactions that you should take advantage of. So, In addition to sort of maintaining your physical presence at your high schools, I think all of your clubs should have two basic goals. One, a weekly goal, and an organizational goal. Now, your weekly goal is basically you want to figure out in some way with your clubs, how are you going to promote conservative ideas each week? And you can do this basically in one of two ways. One, you can simply go out and just attack the left, right? And at most high schools, and even colleges, there's a lot of opportunities to do that. There's a lot of other liberal clubs. You can just go out and attack what they're trying to do. Like, for example, like say there's going to be like an Earth Day fair or an environmental fair at your high school, right? You can get together with your club, go to this Earth Fair and scream like obnoxious slogans like burn the rainforest and shoot the manatees and things like that. And you see the liberal mind explode and have a lot of fun. But you probably won't actually bring everyone to our side. It might be fun to say that stuff to see their reactions. You're probably not going to convince a lot of people to join your organization. I'm not actually encouraging you to do that, although I do think it would be fun. And honestly, if all you do is just react to the left and attack the other side, like frankly, in the end, you're going to lose. Again, let's look back at Ronald Reagan. Like what he did was he didn't just go out and attack when he was president. He just didn't go out and attack every left-wing program. What he did was he identified the greatest weakness on the other side. And specifically with the Soviets, he identified the Berlin Wall as the Soviet system's greatest weakness. Like, why was their system so great? They had to have a Berlin Wall to keep people from leaving, right? So he exploited it. Well, you all want to do that same strategy with your events and programs at your high schools and on your college campuses. But instead of just attacking the other side, really in the end what you want to do is develop your own programs, develop your own initiatives, and promote your ideas in a proactive, positive way to really force the other side to say, oh my gosh, the conservatives got their act together, they're promoting ideas, these are popular programs, and force them to drop what they're doing and respond to you. That's when you know you're being successful, really. And yes, there will be times when you want to respond to the other side, but mostly it's better just to focus on your ideas and your programs and push out your events on their own and not worry what they're doing in most cases. And I'll give you some examples here before I wrap up. Now, your weekly goal will bring you to your organizational goal. And to me, your organizational goal should be pretty obvious, right? Like, you want your organization, your conservative club, to be the most prominent group, period. Not the most prominent conservative club, but the most prominent group at your school. You want to get to the point, right, that whenever a teacher, administrator, or a principal, or even better, like a local newspaper reporter who's writing a story on the young conservative movement or whatever, or needs a comment on from a young conservative, you want that newspaper reporter to automatically think of you and your organization. But the only way you get to that level of being seen as the representative of young conservative leaders in your area, and getting to that point, is by focusing on your weekly goal of promoting your ideas on campus. You know, to building up a presence, to show you have a following, and that you have a successful and effective club. And when I say you want to promote conservative ideas each week, I'm not saying you have to hold all these huge events and all these huge programs and go out and protest all the time. Even doing like small, simple activities like having recruitment tables and putting up simple things like flyers can be very effective if done well. So let me share with you a couple examples. Recruitment tables, very easy to do. Now, this is what you want to avoid though. This is probably the worst example of a recruitment table I've ever seen, right? I was at a local high school in Virginia, and it was on a Friday night right before a football game, and there was like a club drive out front. And I noticed this table for the High School Angler Society, and I was like, man, that was a horrible table. The kids aren't even paying attention. There's nothing attracting you to go talk to them. The only thing they have are like these gross shrink-wrapped muffins or whatever it is. And there's really just nothing there that's enticing, right? So you kind of want to avoid that. Instead, you want to look at something along these lines. This is what we do to try and help you. We give you giant banners, full of graphics, posters, like things that other students actually want, like giant Reagan posters and other swag things that people put up on their MacBooks and things, whatever. So we try and make your activism easy by giving you those things to help you out. Other stuff. Okay, another example. Flyers. Some people are like, flyers, whatever, that's not needed, like who's cares, it's so old school, whatever. But no, flyers can be very effective if done well. First, one of you, yesterday someone asked about getting more members involved, okay, in their clubs. And what you all need to remember is that first, when you get new members, we as conservatives are not natural activists, right? So you're typically not going to have the student who's going to come to your first club meeting who just want to go out and like scream in people's faces right away. Like it's just not going to happen. You might have that random person who will, but that's an exception. So what you have to do is bring people along gradually, and sometimes giving, again, these small, simple activities like hanging up a flyer can be effective in getting them involved. But again, a flyer can be effective in getting your ideas across. I want to share with you one example. We had a student who was running a YAF chapter at a high school in Michigan. And before I get into the example a little more, I want to say that this example occurred several years ago when, I don't know if you recall this example, but it was back when Rush Limbaugh called this liberal activist, Sandra Fluke, a slut, basically. And if you recall, like there's this huge media firestorm about this, and you know, it's really crazy, and eventually Rush apologized. Yet, what was interesting is that this is despite the fact that there's been a number of examples where prominent liberal leaders have called really nasty names to people like Sandra Palin and Michelle Malkin and many others, and the media never says anything about it. And so our YAF chapter at this Michigan high school wanted to point out this hypocrisy, and he wanted to put up these flyers that said, we need to respect all women. Now that should be pretty basic, right? Why would there be any problems with this? So he put the flyers together. These were designed by him, and as you can see, he had a couple examples of why we need to respect all women, and kind of showed the hypocrisy of what was going on at the time. And so he did what he had to do. He went to the principal and wanted to get permission to distribute these on campus. Well, he took them to the principal. The principal said, absolutely not. These are inflammatory, they're offensive. I'm not going to allow you to post these up at our high school. And just real quick, again, our high school YAF chapter chair was not going to let his free speech rights be squelched, so we worked with him to get the story out on Yahoo, Fox News, and many other outlets, and eventually they relented. And we suspect that the following fall, they had a new principal at that high school because of what he did with these flyers and causing an issue towards it. So again, flyers can be effective. And this brings me to one point I want to highlight. Before you organize anything with your chapters, whether it's a speaker, some type of registration drive, or whatever it may be, first think through whether the chosen issue you want to focus on actually matters to other students on your campus, right? So like, sometimes like we as conservatives get caught up in our own ideas and want to talk about those ideas, but don't really think through whether other students at the school actually care about them. So for example, like say you want to bring in a speaker, not that you would, but say you want to bring a speaker in on like Medicare. Like, oh, I love Medicare, I want to talk about Medicare funding and bring speakers in on Medicare. Obviously, if you did that at a high school, it'd be a flop, no one cares. It's kind of like the same thing with taxes. Conservatives like talking about why taxes should be as low as possible. You know, David Newton's speech was great last night. But typically, when you talk about taxes at high schools and certainly on college campuses, they fall flat. Most students don't work a lot, they don't pay a lot of taxes, so it's a dead issue to them. So you always have to think through what are the key issues for students at your high schools? What matters most to them? And your goal with all of your programs, again, is to reach the broadest possible audience. Your goal is not just to have the conservative students at your events, and your goal is not just to have the radical liberals there because they'll attack you half the time. Your goal for all your programs is to get that average student at your campus who basically all he does is after school, he goes back to his home, goes in his room, and plays like, you know, Halo multiplayer for 5 hours or whatever it is. Right? Your goal is to actually get this person to leave his room and go and interact with like live human beings, basically. Like that's your goal. And so you want to think through how do you promote your ideas and your events that resonate with the most students. One final thing, as far as specific sort of strategies. And even in addition to thinking about the ideas and the topics that you're going to cover, you also want to think through, this is getting a little bit advanced, but it's important to think about, you also want to think through the wording you're using in your promotions. Like some of you are going to be operating in some of the most liberal environments imaginable in the country, right? And sometimes if you use the wrong phrases and the wrong terms, it'll make your job much more difficult than it'll need to be. let me show you, kind of explain what I'm talking about. A couple years ago at the foundation, we did a nationwide poll on students on what their views were towards free enterprise and what they felt about free enterprise. And the good news from the poll is that students came back and they said that they don't want more government involvement in their lives, which is great. They felt the government doesn't help the economy and so on. But we also learned from the poll that students had very specific ideas in terms of what they felt and as far as their favorability towards certain terms that we use as conservatives to present our ideas on these subjects. And I want to talk about a few of them here in a second. Capitalism, free market, and entrepreneurship. And again, these are the main terms that we use as conservatives to talk about and highlight sort of the free market issues. And the first term, capitalism. This is the main term that we typically use to talk about this issue. Steve Forbes has a book on how capitalism will save us. Well, it's very interesting that we asked about students' favorability towards the term capitalism, and capitalism only had a 33% favorability among students your age. And you look at free markets, got a little better at a 44% favorability rating. However, entrepreneurship was the strongest, so 66% had a favorability rating towards entrepreneurship. So again, if you're going to talk about capitalism or free markets, whatever you want to use, you have programs, you kind of want to skew towards free market and entrepreneurship and try and avoid capitalism. Now, Young Americans Foundation also has a number of resources to help you at your college and high school campuses to present your ideas on campus. We have a number of activism guides that help you fundraise and avoid activist traps. Before I wrap up, I just want to take a little bit of time to talk about 3 specific activities that all of you can organize this fall on your high school campuses. The first comes in September, and that is the 9/11 Never Forget Project. How many of you here have organized this before? A few of you. This year is the 15th anniversary, and it's probably one of the strongest events you can organize. This is a program we started in 2003 when we were approaching the 2nd anniversary of the terrorist attacks. We noticed that a lot of colleges and high schools were pretty much ignoring the anniversary. And here it was, the most recent huge attack in American history, and most schools were kind of ignoring the day. And so we created the Never Forget Project to help you all encourage your school to properly remember the anniversary. And the main activity as part of the project is the American Flag Memorial, and it's basically 3,000 American flags to represent each person killed in the terrorist attacks, and it has a real strong sort of visual impact on students, and it's a very strong visual reminder of how our country was impacted on this day. And we have students who are in homeschool, in private schools, and public schools who organize it, and it's also always very well received. Let's go to October. How many of you guys know who this guy is? Che. Yes, Che Guevara. Well, a lot of your classmates have no idea. Sometimes they'll see you got one of the people, Hollywood celebrities and so on, wearing T-shirts with his face. You'll see some students walking around with a T-shirt with his face on it. There's movies out there called The Motorcycle Diaries where they just portray him as a nice poet and whatever. But really, this guy was basically a murderer and a thug. He murdered kids in his guerrilla camps who were simply accused of stealing food. He murdered his friends who didn't completely reject democratic ideals. He's responsible for the revolution in Cuba that murdered the largest percentage of any country in the world, basically, as far as a revolution is concerned. And so we felt we needed to have some type of event to help educate students on who Che really was. And so we discovered that October 9th was the day that he was executed. And so we used that day as No More Che Day. And so we helped give you guys a number of resources, materials that you can give out and distribute at your high schools, such as our Victims of Che Guevara poster. And given how much Cuba is talked about and how wonderful Cuba is now, we have this poster we can send to you. We also have a number of downloadable flyers that we can pass along to help really underscore who Che really was. And you might not be able to tell, but the image of Che, the iconic image, is actually a photo mosaic of all the people that, or some of the people that Che had a role in killing in Cuba. So it kind of instantly has sort of that visual impact to show who he truly was. And lastly, in November is Freedom Week. And you'll notice, especially when you get to college campuses, there's a lot of like themed weeks, like coming out weeks and stuff like that that occur. Well, we came up with Freedom Week to kind of give you a week to kind of hammer home ideas that you really like. And basically, Freedom Week emphasizes the November 9th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and Veterans Day. And both of these activities and events or holidays, whatever you want to call them, fall during the same week. So it gives you guys an opportunity to have a full week-long program to emphasize issues that you really love. So whether it's like supporting the troops, having drives to support the troops in your area, but also to kind of underscore the failures of socialism. Rachel Campos Duffy talked about how Bernie Sanders is so popular among young people and how they don't know what socialism was all about. Well, one thing we really encourage students to do during Freedom Week is to build and then tear down a Berlin Wall. And it's not just for the sake of just remembering the anniversary, but it's to also kind of emphasize and hammer home that these ideas have been tried numerous times and have failed. And in doing so, they have murdered almost about 100 million people in doing so. So that's something you can do. And lastly, we can help you all bring a conservative speaker to your high schools. And we have set it up in the past where we set up a full school assembly and bring in one of our prominent speakers and they can talk about conservative ideas at your high schools. And we love to make that happen for you guys. And one of the best parts about bringing in a speaker that you don't get with any other activity is the live interaction, right? Like, there is nothing better than, say, during the Q&A session, and you have like an ignorant liberal student, or even better, an arrogant professor or teacher get up and ask what they think is like a tough question to like Dinesh D'Souza or Ann Coulter, and they tear down their arguments in front of like the whole student body. Like, it is just awesome. Like, it's something you have to experience during your time as a student. So I would encourage you to do that if you can, and we'll be glad to help you. I just want to wrap up by saying there's a lot of reasons to get active now. You don't want to wait till after you graduate, because after you graduate, not just high school, but even college, sometimes people wait and say, hey, I'll wait till after I'm done with college and I'll be active then. But don't do that, because after you graduate college, you're going to be faced with the 3 M's: mortgage, marriage, and munchkins. And all these things are going to take time away from doing stuff that you love to do, okay? So now is the best time to be active. And even just a little bit of activism can be tremendously effective, and I have proof. Before I wrap up, I just want to share this quick email that we got from UCSB right up the road. This is an email that we got that was written by a liberal activist on campus. And we had one of our yappers on campus get on their listserv, right? And so we got this email that was sent from one liberal activist to all of his liberal buddies. And before I read this email, I want to set up what was going on campus, okay? So before this email was sent out, the conservatives on campus had brought in just one conservative speaker, and they were about to bring in a second. So let me read what this liberal activist says to his liberal friends prior to the second conservative speaker coming onto campus. The liberal student begins by writing, "Hey all, I appreciate that we want to get together and welcome Uncle Ward onto our campus. However, I personally do not see the issue being about Ward Connerly. It is not an accident that Oliver North came to our campus last quarter, nor is Puppet Connerly's visit this quarter a coincidence. Someone spent time and money bringing them onto our campus. This weekend, the Conservative Club has sponsored Young America's Foundation to hold a training on right-wing campus government insurgency. This is for real. There's a growing conservative movement on this campus." Now, give me a break. Like, UCSB is one of the most liberal schools in the country. There are liberal events going on every single day, and the conservatives at that school can bring in just 2 speakers, just 2, and the left is like freaking out about it. This shows you the impact you can have just by being involved. So again, thanks for your time, and I'm glad to answer a few questions.